IB Nation, welcome back to another episode of the Irish Breakdown Podcast brought to you by FanDuel. Happy Tuesday. It is August 12th, which means we are now under the 20-day mark until Notre Dame begins their 2025 season. They kick off in 19 days down in Miami inside of Hard Rock Stadium. And we are going to continue a lot of what we're doing in the offseason here. Today, we are going to be previewing the SEC. Now, similar to what we did yesterday, is we're going to start out by talking about what implications that has for Notre Dame. Because in recent seasons, Notre Dame has kind of picked up their performance, I guess you could say, against the SEC, and they've started to perform a little bit better, especially under this new regime with Marcus Freeman. But there were some little hints of it starting to turn around before he took over as head coach in 2022. And then afterwards, we're going to dive into our conference preview, looking at the conference as a whole, very similar to what we did yesterday. We're going over conference superlatives. We're going to be talking about offensive players of the year and defensive players of the year. And then, of course, we'll be breaking down who we believe to be top to bottom, where the teams are going to be ranked. But, Brian, it is another edition of our conference previews here, and this one's going to be another fun one.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one, Trevor, because obviously anytime you're talking about the SEC, it's going to spark some conversation, and it's going to spark some debate about, the dominance of the SEC and are they the best conference out there, and you get back into it. It's funny listening to SEC people make arguments that back up what I used to say as to why there were years they weren't the best league. And well, yeah, maybe we haven't won championships, but, just top to bottom. And I'm like, yeah, that your argument used to be, well, we've won X number of championships in a row. That was your argument. And now you're arguing the exact opposite of what the Big Ten used to say is, yeah, well, we're deeper back in the day. And so it is kind of funny to see how those things kind of, circle back and depending on who's dominating. But this is going to be an interesting year. We're going to have fun talking about it. But when you look at it from a Notre Dame standpoint, Trevor, obviously Notre Dame is scheduling more SEC teams in recent years. You've obviously had the series with Georgia. And when I say SEC, I'm talking about like real SEC teams, not like we go back and retroactively count the 2015 win over Texas as a SEC win. I don't care about that. I don't count the 2012 Oklahoma. 2012, we may have lost to Alabama, but we beat another SEC team. Oh yeah, who was that? Oklahoma. No, you beat a Big 12 team. They may be in the SEC now, but you beat a Big 12 team, and we did that with Stanford as well. We didn't count Stanford wins prior to 2024 when we talked about Notre Dame's record against the ACC because they were not ACC teams. But you're obviously last year when you talk about playing Texas A&M during the season, and then this year you're going to have a game against Texas A&M and Arkansas, and then of course Notre Dame last year. My buddy likes to say, Notre Dame's won a conference championship last year, and I was like, what are you talking about? And he goes like, yeah, they're the SEC champs, and I was like, oh yeah, okay, I get that. They beat the SEC champs, but then that would make Ohio State the SEC champs because they beat Texas and Notre Dame, and who beat, you know what I mean? So. But the point being, they've had more opportunities to kind of make some statements against the SEC, and they're making better statements than maybe they used to. And I think it matters, and that's what this first topic is going to be about. Trev is it is important to have success against the SEC on and off the field, because if you want to have the kind of roster that allows you to go and win championships, that's what it requires, because whether you agree with it or not, this is still the perceived best league in college football. It's still located where the majority of the best talent is located. If you want to get the best players, you still have to go against these schools to get them. And so having a track record of success against the better schools in that league and just the league overall, which we'll talk about, is important. So I'm excited about it. And then, man, our SEC prediction show is going to be fun because – like I went through it and marked wins, and I'm like, okay, that team's not going to be as good as I thought they were going to be, and it's gonna be an interesting conversation, Trev, and I'm very, very much looking forward to it. It's going to be a fun day.
Agreed. I think you touched on a really good point, Brian. It's about perception, and I think the SEC is still kind of used as college football's measuring tool. You hear it in games all the time. You hear it in College Game Day all the time. Fox Big Noon Kickoff. They kind of use the SEC as a measuring tool to see how other teams stack up. How do they stack up against the SEC? Those are kind of the big headlines. You get some of that with teams in the Big Ten, but more specifically, it's how do they stack up against Ohio State? I think we can all kind of agree on that. But like the conference as a whole.
Maybe Penn State and Michigan, depending on the year.
Yes, yeah, agreed. But by and large, it's mostly how do you stack up against the SEC? What all goes into that? Well, the AP poll dropped yesterday. 10 of the 16 teams in the SEC are ranked in the preseason top 25, and 6 of them are ranked inside of the top 15. So there is still this belief that the SEC is the most dominant conference across college football. Argument could be made that some people believe them to still be the deepest conference in college football because of their rankings. Now, I'm also not naive to the fact that some teams may get a little bit of benefit of the doubt because they do play in the SEC.
Exactly.
A very real factor as well. But for the most part, when you look at this conference big picture, a lot of people compare those. Why? I mean, look, at the end of the day, Texas A&M and Louisville finished with, did they both finish 8-5 last season? Or did Louisville finish
No,
7-6?
Louisville was 9-4.
Okay. Louisville was
Yeah.
9-4. I think Texas A&M finished 8-5.
8-5.
But at the
yeah.
but at the end of Notre Dame's season, who did they say was the bigger win? It's Texas A&M
Texas
at
A&M,
8-5.
exactly.
Because they went on the road in SEC country and pulled away a win. From a win-loss record, Georgia was the most, I guess you could make the argument, unimpressive team that Notre Dame beat in the playoffs because, you know, they came into their conference championship with 2 losses already, and then Notre Dame handed IU their second loss of the season, and then Penn State, they played them in the semifinals. But the SEC win over the Georgia win in the Sugar Bowl is still kind of considered their biggest They were able to beat Georgia. A lot of it is
their
about
statement
perception.
win. Right. It's not about Indiana. It's not about Penn State. It's, oh my gosh, they beat Georgia. Holy moly. Can you believe it? Right. 100%.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I mean, Trev, when you like it or not, there's a reason for that, and it's not just SEC bias. I mean, there was a time not that long ago where the SEC was clearly the best league in college football most years. There's the occasional years that I thought this league might have been better, or maybe that league might have been better, but for the most part, it has been the best league in college football. And for all the reasons that I talked about earlier, it's a league that's going to always get that attention because it's a league where just obviously you've got the ESPN deal, and you know it's the bias that they're going to have because it helps them, it benefits them financially to promote the league that they pay the most money to. You know, you talk about we mentioned earlier, just a lot of the top talent in the country is from that region. And so that's going to impact things. You know, look, you want to go down and recruit Georgia, North Carolina, and all these states that you and I always talk about that they want to recruit now Texas and all of those type of things. It's like, okay, well, having success against the SEC makes that a lot easier. You don't think that it's a coincidence that Notre Dame went down south and had their best D-line haul ever, or not ever, like in a decade? The year, like right after they beat Georgia and Texas A&M in the college, you know, like by double digits both games. I mean, and what did Notre Dame's defense do in both games? Dominated. I mean, like they can look, dude, man, yeah, Georgia has great D linemen, but man, did you watch Notre Dame's D line against Georgia? Like, I promise you, that's been discussed with Notre Dame coaches and recruits in the South, and it's usually not the Notre Dame coaches bringing it up; it's the players or the coaches. Of the high school players that are bringing it up. That stuff matters, Trev. And Notre Dame, you know, has a history, honestly, of where it hasn't been able to make those kind of statements, and it's been true for over a decade. And you know, as you just one season of success doesn't all of a sudden change the narrative. What I like about this season is you get a second straight opportunity to change the narrative, which I think is important, but let's talk a little bit, Trev, about where this narrative came from. And to me, it really goes back to sort of the Charlie Weiss era, because Notre Dame didn't play a lot of SEC teams in the Ty Willingham era and the Bob Davie era. Like, they were playing Georgia Tech and Colorado and Oregon State in bowl games. They weren't playing a ton of SEC teams. Bob Davie, in fact, one year beat LSU in the regular season, then lost in the Independence Bowl in a rematch. Outside of that, you know, I mean, you got to go back to the Holtz era. They were playing A&M, but back then A&M was a Southwest Conference team. You know, Lou played Alabama. Last time Notre Dame played Alabama in the regular season was 1987 under Lou Holtz. So it's been a while, and you know, from the Lou Holtz era to the Brian Kelly era, where they just didn't have a lot of games against the SEC. A lot of the bowl matchups don't pit them against each other, but they did have that game at the end of 2006. And Notre Dame got absolutely dominated by LSU. That game carried a lot more weight, for example, than the fact that they blew Tennessee out in the regular season. Why? Because Tennessee wasn't that good. It was that bowl game that mattered. Then you fast forward, 5-6 years after that, and all of a sudden Notre Dame's got squared up against Alabama in the national title game, and Alabama just blows the doors off of Notre Dame. And then you play them again in 2020, blow the doors off of Notre Dame. And then they had 2 games against Georgia. And, yeah, Notre Dame was competitive, but your claim to fame against the SEC for 15 years was, well, we beat 2 5-loss LSU teams, and, hey, we beat Vanderbilt. And, oh, by the way, we almost beat Georgia twice. And when that's your sort of your talking point, you don't have success that you can brag about playing against the SEC. That's changed under Marcus Freeman, and it didn't actually start last year. But I think that when you look at the track record against those teams, Trev, that there is the number of bad losses is one good season does not change that unless you win the title, and they didn't do that. But I think that looking at the history, that's obviously something that you can't dismiss as a Notre Dame fan as to where this narrative came from. It didn't just come out because of ESPN bias. ESPN's bias came about because of the fact that you did go toe-to-toe against these teams, and you very rarely looked good at all.
No, that's a great point. And to your point, Brian, we started to see some things turn around when Marcus Freeman took over. We saw them beat South Carolina in the Gator Bowl in 2022. That was a win over a ranked SEC team. And then, you fast forward to this past season, you go down to College Station, you beat Texas A&M on the road in a hostile environment, and then you're able to knock off Georgia in the playoffs, the SEC champs. But you're going to have to be able to kind of be crowned the king of college football at the end of the season for that to keep carrying weight over. But you're still seeing the SEC bias week in and week out. I do want to ask you something before we kind of keep moving along in this conversation, because Texas gets a lot of benefit of the doubt this season. They have the best odds to win the national championship on FanDuel. They're the AP number 1 team in the country. They're the coaches poll number 1 team in the country all preseason. And then we've spent a lot of time this offseason talking about how it feels like every one of their position groups is just magically now the best in the country. Do you think that they would still be getting this much recognition if they were still in the Big 12? Like if they still had Arch Manning but they were still in the Big 12, are they just the consensus no-brainer number 1 team in the country, you think?
I do think that, because they made their first playoff appearance under Sark as a Big 12 team. Now, they were headed to the SEC, but they were a Big 12 team. If that deal never happened and they go to the playoff and play Washington and they make the college football playoff this year, odds are if they're in the Big 12, they're probably ranked higher than 5th. They wouldn't have had the bad loss to Georgia in there. They would have looked more dominant than they even did last season, and they would have still had a higher seed. And and I think that they went to the college football playoff last year and went to the semifinals and played Ohio State tougher than anybody else did. I mean, you can't deny those things. And if they did that as a Big 12 team, I do think they'd still be getting the same hype, because it's Texas and because the brand. Do I think that ESPN wouldn't be hyping them up as much as they are? Maybe not, because they don't have the Big 12. But the national media, they're and that's about the rabidness and size of the fan base and the need to generate clicks and what fan bases tend to do that for you. Well, Georgia Alabama, I'll eventually get to that team. Texas has got one of those fan bases that they're going to engage with you if you talk about them, and whether they get mad at you for saying that they're not the greatest thing since sliced bread, or whether they're agreeing with you and liking what you're saying, they're going to engage with you. And I think that's one of those things that when I look at this football team and I look at the hype that they'd be getting, the fact that they do have Arch Manning, the fact that they do have Steve Sarkisian, who won a title at Alabama as the offensive coordinator, the fact that they are Texas and they are a big boy, I still think they'd be getting a lot of hype, because we saw that back in the day. We saw Texas they were always really highly ranked under Mac Brown. And they would then go out and still get whooped by Oklahoma and still get beaten some of the bigger games they played, but they still got all that hype. They still got all that preseason hype because it was Texas. And, like Mac Brown takes over for he goes 9-5 in 2000 in 1999, and they finished in the top 25. They lost their last 3 games of the year to Texas A&M, Nebraska, and Tennessee and Arkansas, and they still finished in the top 25. You look at 2000, after that 5-loss season, their preseason, the number 6 team in the country, despite going 9-5 the year. They go 9-3 that season in 2000 and get beat by Oregon in a bowl game, get blasted by Texas 63-14, get beat by Stanford in 2000. And that next year, they had, by the way, 1 ranked win that year. It was over Texas A&M. That next year, that team that finished outside the top 10 is once again preseason number 5 team in the country. And then that year, they were pretty good. They were 11-2 that year. In 2001, they come out in 2002. They're preseason number 3 team. Now, they had never climbed that high. Like they spent 1 week the year before ranked 3rd, and that was going into the Big 12 title game, and they got beat by Colorado. So they go out the next year. They're preseason number 3. They go 9-2. They finish the year ranked number 6. So they come out in 2003 as again number 5 team in the country. They get beat by Arkansas. They get blown out by Oklahoma again. They get beat by Washington State in the bowl game. They finish outside the top 10. And the next year they're preseason number 7 team in the country. And that year they were pretty good. That was the 04 team where they went 11-1 and beat Michigan. So then they begin the next season, preseason number 2. And then, it was just kind of on and on and on. They lose Vince Young, lose a lot of talent. They go the next year in 06, after they win the title, they're preseason number 2. They get beat by Ohio State, get beat by K-State, get beat by Texas A&M. They finish the year ranked 13th. And in 2007, Texas comes out and they're preseason number 4 team in the country. Right? I mean, so this isn't new. I think the hype is more noticeable now because it's not just the polls that hype them up like it used to be. It's now every preseason magazine, all 953 of the college football shows on YouTube, every preseason magazine, all like 9,478 CFB analysts that are on YouTube and have a YouTube page, all are hyping up Texas because now the groupthink sets in and we're just more saturated with it. There's just more thrown at us about the hype about Texas, but it was always there. And Texas always got some of that SEC type of hype because they're Texas. That's why they got the Longhorn Network and nobody else did. So I think it would be similar. Maybe not quite the same because maybe ESPN doesn't hype them up as much because they wouldn't be partnered with ESPN. They'd be, with Fox and in the Big 12, but they would be getting a ton of hype. I mean, I just went through it. Every year they finish outside the top 10 and they get ranked in the top 5 in the next season. Notre Dame doesn't get that benefit out. Notre Dame finishes 2nd and then they're preseason number 6 the next year, right? A complete opposite type of situation. And so, yeah, I think that they would still be getting similar to that, but it gets put on steroids a little bit when they are in the SEC.
Yeah, I agree. We view that the same. It was just something I was thinking about, how much of them now being in the SEC kind of plays a factor. But Brian, we're talking about just Notre Dame in comparison to the SEC, what it means from a perception standpoint. But you touched on something earlier that I wanted to circle back on, and it's really, why does this matter? Why does Notre Dame's kind of relationship with the SEC, what weight does that carry? We talked a lot yesterday about Notre Dame's relationship with the ACC, and that one's a little bit more cut and dry because they have the scheduling agreement and they play at least 5 games against each other every year and then just scheduled Clemson to that 12-game or 12-year home and home series. The SEC, you kind of have to look a little bit deeper into it. Some of it's on the recruiting trail, some of it's perception, but big picture, why does it matter that Notre Dame has success against the SEC?
Well, the first reason's obvious because they're now on the schedule. And so you've now got SEC teams on the schedule. You had Georgia in 17, Vandy in 18, Georgia in 19. You were supposed to have Arkansas in 2020 before that season got canceled, or at least that schedule got kind of torn up and thrown out because of all the craziness in the world. And, you've seen more of it. And then recently, obviously, you had Texas A&M on the schedule last year. This year, you have Texas A&M and Arkansas again. And so you have an opportunity now to go head-to-head against these teams in non-bowl game situations, which means you're going on their campuses. In the last 2 years, we have heard from media people at ESPN that Texas A&M is the hardest place to play. And then when you listen to them do Arkansas games after the Tennessee game, this is one of the hardest places to play. Now, miraculously, Kyle Field is apparently not that hard to play in, according to CFB 2026 video game. Well, it's because why? Because Notre Dame and Texas went in there and beat them last year. Doesn't change the environment. Just means those teams were better than Texas A&M, as I say all the time. Now it's, you got to go to Arkansas, and that's a loud stadium, and all these people and all this other kind of stuff. And so you have opportunities to have success where you can say, look, man, we've won how many straight games against the SEC? Well, this will be what, 5? Won't this be 5? Because they didn't play anybody. They lost the only SEC team they played in 2020. I don't believe Notre Dame played anyone in the SEC in 2021 under Brian Kelly, correct? Because they played Oklahoma State in a bowl game, Florida State, Wisconsin, Cincinnati Tech, USC, North Carolina, Georgia Tech. Yeah, no SEC teams in 2021. Then you come out in 2022, so you've lost your most recent game, and that season Notre Dame goes out and beats South Carolina in a bowl game, a ranked South Carolina team. And then nobody in 23, and then in 24 you beat Texas A&M, you beat Georgia, and then now you get a chance to play Texas A&M, who will probably be ranked. So not only do you get a chance to extend your winning streak against the SEC to 5, 4 of those 5 teams were ranked when you played them. And I would imagine that Arkansas won't be ranked because they got to play at Memphis and at Ole Miss before they play Notre Dame. Now, if they win those games, then they're going to be ranked, and it's not out of the question for them to win those games, which we'll get into when we get into our SEC predictions. But 5 games in a row against the SEC, that's now like you have some bragging rights, and you can say, "Well, I haven't beat any of the good teams." Well, we beat A&M twice, and we beat your champ last year by double digits in the postseason. So I think it certainly gives them some brag. Oh, South Carolina fans, Notre Dame's okay. Well, we beat you last time we played you, so I mean, you can. Right now there's only one fan base in the SEC that has a right to talk trash to Notre Dame, and that's Alabama. Georgia can't anymore. LSU never could, and they thought they could. What about 06? I mean, we've played twice since then, so I mean, maybe you should shut your pie hole. What fan base right now can sit there and say, well, last time we played you, okay, yeah, Missouri, you might have beat Notre Dame last time you played in 1977 or something like that. I think Ole Miss, I actually think beat Notre Dame the last time they played, I think, because that was 1977. I believe that is the last time they played. Nobody cares about that. And so it's more about, last 15, 20 years. And so being able to have that kind of dominance to where you can still have that sort of actually, I was wrong. They played in 1985 and Notre Dame beat them. So Ole Miss can't even say that anymore. But I think that's what it boils down to for me, Trev, is to have that sort of bragging rights, but also getting into the postseason and the playoff. You're now looking at it to where these 2 wins are going to be matched up and compared to other SEC teams when it comes to seeding. When you talk about, Notre Dame didn't play anybody. Well, A&M's a pretty good team, but then you look at it and you're like, okay, well, Texas A&M has to play Texas this year, and they have to play. I think Arkansas plays. Let me pull up the schedule here real quick. Arkansas plays. So Texas A&M has to play Florida. They have to play Texas and South Carolina, 3 teams who potentially are going to be playoff teams. And then you look at Arkansas this year, they have to play Ole Miss, they have to play Tennessee, they have to play Texas A&M, they have to play LSU, and they have to play Texas. All 5 of those teams have a shot to some degree of being a playoff team. Well, if you're getting into seeding, now you can say, well, look, Notre Dame played this team and you played that team, and this is how Notre Dame performed against those teams, and this is how you performed against those teams. And you start to say, okay, that's something you can compare. And then you can start getting into some of the, they didn't, Georgia and Notre Dame didn't play the same teams, but there's this, there's that. And you start getting to some of that, like down the road stuff that I don't love as much, but it just gives you another gauge to say, look, we faced 2 SEC teams, one at home, one on the road, and you beat them both and hopefully beat one of them convincingly. And I think that's a big part of it when it comes to jockeying for position in the postseason. I mean, if you replace Stanford last year or Miami of Ohio last year for, just pick a middle of the road SEC team, Missouri, Kentucky, Missouri, like that's even beating a bad Kentucky. Like, let's say so not even a middle of the road. Missouri's a good middle of the road team. Let's pick a bad SEC team. Okay, you beat Kentucky instead of Miami of Ohio. That's going to matter because you say, well, look, I mean, you're talking about this team should get in the playoffs. Kentucky beat them at their place, and we beat them by 40. Like that would matter more than beating a Miami of Ohio, than beating a Minnesota, who's a better Big Ten team, or beating a Georgia Tech in some instances. So I think that's a big reason why. Is I just think that having those wins, because of the hype and the narrative, guys, you think the committee isn't influenced by the perception of the SEC? Of course they are. You don't think voters are influenced by the perception of the SEC? Of course they are. And so when you have a chance to say, hey, look, we went toe-to-toe against these teams and we stacked up, not only do we win the game, but we handled them physically. Our speed was right there with them. All those things matter. Whereas if you go play a Vanderbilt in 2018 and you barely beat them, and then they go have a losing record in the SEC, it doesn't look as good. Like when I use the Kentucky example, if you'd have beat Kentucky 24-21, that wouldn't be perceived well. Well, look, dude, they beat Ole Miss. They almost beat Georgia. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Those are SEC games. They're different. It's nonsense, but that's what they would say. Well, we beat them by 40. We beat them by 30. That stuff starts to matter. And so I think that's a big reason why it's important. It's because you don't have like the conference to rely on. You like if you're comparing a couple Big Ten teams to SEC teams from a seeding standpoint, well, the Big Ten's not as strong as the SEC. Oh, timeout. Hold on a second. Ohio State beat Texas. Michigan went on the road and beat Oklahoma. I mean, you have some of these matchups where your conference can boost you up. So you say, well, Indiana's not that good or Iowa's not that good. Well, hold on a second. They beat a team that went and beat an SEC team. You know what I mean? And where Notre Dame doesn't have that. And the only thing that they do have, if you're ever going to use it at all, is the ACC, who's been getting dominated by the SEC in recent years. You can't say, well, hey, we dominate the ACC, because then the SEC can be like, yeah, so do we. So who cares? But when you've got your own toe-to-toe against them, and at least one of them being a pretty good team, I think that certainly helps raise your profile on the field. And then, of course, Trevor, there's the off-the-field aspect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Perception is just such a huge part of this discussion. When I look at Notre Dame in comparison to the SEC, it's everything. It's recruiting. It's your perceived wins on the field. I'll draw back to what I said earlier. Now, let me clarify, because I saw there was also some confusion in the chat. I also don't think that Georgia was their most underwhelming win. Let me say that loud and clear. I think that it was because of the perception of the win, because of what it meant to beat the SEC champions. But at the end of the day, we're talking about Georgia's two-loss team, whose two losses were to two teams who didn't play in the conference championship and didn't make the playoffs. And in the final game of the regular season, went to 8 overtimes against a team that Notre Dame beat 31-13 in Atlanta, Georgia. And so, but why was it a big win? They beat the SEC champs. You hear it every single weekend, especially when Notre Dame plays a night game. They have SEC size. I was down on the field.
Speed.
Yes, I was down there on the field on pregame, and Notre Dame has SEC speed and SEC size and length, and so from a perception standpoint, it's huge. I'm not saying that it's right, that they're the only measuring tool for the rest of college football. I think Ohio State needs to be in that discussion. Penn State, maybe Oregon to a degree, Michigan depending on the year, Clemson depending on the year,
Florida State depending on the year. Yeah.
Yes, but by and large, it is always the SEC. So perception is such a huge thing. But then, of course, like you said, Brian, the off-the-field things, recruiting. You always stack up to how you recruit against the SEC. A lot of just, again, same conversation with before. You also stack up to see how you recruit against Clemson and Ohio State and Oregon. But it's a big deal when Notre Dame can go down into the South and get players in Alabama and in Georgia and in Florida. And so off-the-field stuff is huge when we're talking about Notre Dame versus the SEC.
Yeah. Roger Dodger, our resident USC fan, said, I don't think USC lost a game to the SEC this century. Perhaps he's blocked out 2016 out of his mind. That would count as part of this century, correct? So I can understand why he's blocked that out of his head a little bit.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, yeah, I would imagine so. But no, I think the recruiting piece in all seriousness, Trevor, is incredibly important. It's incredibly important because the reality is in for the most part, when you want to get players from the South, you're going to have to be able to convince them that you need to leave close by. You need to leave your home. You need to leave your region. You need to leave the people that you're comfortable with and come up to Notre Dame. And your reasoning for that has to be something that's compelling. And it can't just be academics for all those kids. There will be some kids that matters a ton, and we've seen that for Notre Dame. But there's going to be some kids who are like, yeah, coach, that's compelling, but I also want to be an NFL draft pick. I also want to do this. I also want to win a championship. And then the reality is you didn't really have those. You didn't really have those metrics that you could look at and point to and say, hey, look, you need to come up here because not only are you going to get an education that just can't be matched in the SEC, with all due respect, even to Vanderbilt, but you're going to get a chance to be a high draft pick. You're going to get a chance to compete for a championship. You're going to get a chance to play the best teams in the country. Look, we got Alabama on the schedule. We got Texas on the schedule. We got, we've played Georgia. We play this, we play that. I think those things matter. And when you're talking about trying to convince young men to come play for you, when you're trying to convince families and parents to say, hey, this is why you should let your child come play for us, because we can provide him these opportunities. Well, what makes you say you can provide those opportunities, coach? Well, look what we've done. And that stuff matters, Trev. I mean, you can say it doesn't matter, and oh, you're a good salesman or whatever, but it does matter. It absolutely matters. And when you can say, we know we can beat those teams because we've played those teams, and when we've played those teams, we've done this, we've accomplished this, you're going to have a lot of success. And that's the opportunity that Notre Dame has. And it's about building on the success that you had in the postseason last year. You can't, like, remember in 2012 when they beat Notre Dame, when Notre Dame beat Oklahoma, it was like a huge win for Notre Dame. And then what happened the next year? Oklahoma comes into Notre Dame Stadium and smacks them in the mouth. You can't allow that kind of thing to happen, because then all of a sudden, all the momentum we're talking about, out the window. And then no one's going to care that you beat Arkansas. But yeah, Arkansas finished 13th in the SEC or whatever, 8th in the SEC or 7th in the SEC. And then that stuff just won't matter as much. So I think that's huge for Notre Dame to continue. Hey guys, we won 5 in a row against the SEC. So I don't want to. And as I think about it, let's just say that, I mean, the three wins they've had, only one of them was by single digits, and that was South Carolina. So, I mean, You beat A&M by 10 last year. You beat Georgia by 13 last year. Hopefully you can continue that level of double-digit victory, because at the end of the day, it's just about winning. So I think the recruiting piece of this is very important as well. And arguably just as important, because the recruiting success then will start leading to more on-field success. I mean, so obviously the on-field part matters if you're being compared in the postseason directly to A&M. So they're coming down who should be seated higher, Notre Dame or Texas A&M. They're both 11-1. Well, Notre Dame, because they beat them in the head-to-head. And that's kind of how that would work. And so I think that to me is very important. It's immediate, but when you talk about long-lasting impact, it's what that type of success does for you on the recruiting trail as you're looking to put together another great class. So I think those are the big reasons why. And then also the perception starts to change even nationally and in SEC territory. You just, how Notre Dame is treated is going to be different. When we talk about treated by the media and treated by ESPN and things like that, where now all of a sudden Notre Dame gets there comes a point in time where they're going to care enough about their reputation that they know that they can't spin certain things. I think everybody for the most part in the media gets that, especially for the national people. Like, look, I can spin this to a certain degree, but I can't keep spinning this, because this team is just, they've done too well. Like, you don't hear them talk about Ohio State not having SEC speed. You don't hear that. Why? Because Ohio State's had enough success against the SEC. And with all due respect, one win by Missouri over Ohio State isn't going to change that. It's Ohio State has earned that. And, if you want to have that respect, you've got to earn it on the field. not by beating ACC teams or Big Ten teams or Big 12 teams or independents or AAC teams, but by beating SEC teams and beating the best SEC teams and doing it consistently. That's going to be the key. And that's the opportunity that Notre Dame has on their 2025 schedule with those 2 games against A&M and Arkansas, which ironically are SEC teams. They've been in the SEC for a while, but they used to be they used to be Southwest Conference teams back in the day. Arkansas was the first team to bolt the Southwest Conference and go to the SEC. Did I think in 90, 91, 92 is when they bolted. So, yeah.
Well, you're right. The national championship conversation around the SEC is still extremely prevalent. I mean, FanDuel has 4 of the top 10 national championship odds belong to SEC teams. Texas is the number 1, Georgia's the number 2, Alabama's the number 5, and LSU's the number 8. All of them have greater odds to win the national championship than I believe what Notre Dame does at plus 1,400. And Texas is number 1 at plus 550 on FanDuel. So there's a lot of things that still point in that direction. Perception is going to be huge. And one of the things that I like about Notre Dame's recent success about the SEC is now there's no, to your point, you have to start giving credit where credit's due. But now there's also not as many excuses if they want to try to spin Notre Dame beating SEC teams either. There's not a, well, we just weren't prepared for it, we didn't see it coming type of conversation. Haven't heard a whole lot of that. I honestly thought that I was going to hear a little bit more of it after they beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl last year. But people aren't going to be surprised when they see Notre Dame coming anymore. They know what this team is. They beat the SEC champs last year. They beat Texas A&M down in Kyle Field last year. So it's going to be interesting to watch how they handle that new type of pressure, not being kind of the rising new kid on the block to the SEC. Now it's like, okay, this team is legit. This team is for real. And that's going to be fun to see.
You still get some, the quarterback was out, but a lot of people that I see whose opinion I actually care about, they look at Notre Dame and they're like, yeah, it wasn't, the quarterback impacted the game, but they also watched Notre Dame whoop Georgia in the trenches, especially the Notre Dame defense. They watched Notre Dame rip off big plays in that game and make big plays in that game. So I think people that actually care about integrity, care about, being correct, they've been willing to say that was a big win. Yeah, the quarterback was out. Sure, that matters. But guys, we watched that game. Notre Dame was the better team that day. And that's it's always fun to be able to look back and say, yeah, they were the better team that day. Well, what if they had the quarterback? Yeah, what if Notre Dame had Riley Mills, and what if Notre Dame had Benjamin Morrison, and what if Notre Dame had Boubacar Traore, and we can do this game we can play. What if Jeremiah Love was 100% healthy?
What if they had
the fact is, they won. They played and they won, and that's what matters. And when you do it enough, and you're consistent enough with it, then you get to the point where the spin stops because that's kind of what they do. You can't keep making excuses. That's just what they do. And last year we saw a little bit of that. Well, if you had to play Marcel Reed, I don't know if that game would have gone the same way for you at Texas A&M. Okay. All right, I watched Marcel Reed get beat by USC, so you can stop that now. But the real ones, I think, no, they don't say that. Fans are always going to spin things a certain way.
Sure.
It's just can you and that's not the perception we're talking about. We're more talking about the people that high school recruits are going to listen to and voters are going to listen to. They're not getting into the fan debates. They're getting into more of like a wow, this is you listen to Kirby Smart talk about Notre Dame in that press conference. The level of respect he clearly had for what he saw on film was obvious, and vice versa. I mean, the press conference between Marcus Freeman and Kirby Smart went way different than the one between Marcus Freeman and James Franklin, because Kirby Smart knew, hey, we got our hands full today. And James Franklin, I don't know what the heck he was thinking, but that's kind of where I'm at. So, yeah, it's a big year.
It is. It really is. Well, that's going to do it for part 1 of today's show. Don't go anywhere, folks. We are getting ready to dive into our SEC preview. But before we get there, you guys know what to do. Be sure to smash that like button. And then, as always, the best way to support what we do here, subscribe to the premium message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com.